Do you believe there's any sort of life after death? I had a very odd experience with this when I was at university. I was sitting in a lecture, and there was a guy there who was a professor of history at Oxford, and he was giving a lecture about something not very motivating on the day, I have to be honest. And this slightly eccentric gentleman, well-known name, Lord Dacre of Glanton, famous historian, paused mid-lecture on Gibbon or Macaulay or something of the sort, and he said, "Gentlemen," now ladies had been admitted to the university for years, but somehow he never even saw them. "Gentlemen, I want you to realise that the best attested fact in the ancient world is that Jesus Christ died and rose from the dead." Can you believe that? Can you believe that a person could live and then die and then be walking around again, absolutely fit and fine, eating and drinking and talking? And can you believe that? Well, Lord Darling, former Lord Chief Justice, said no intelligent jury in the world could fail to bring in a verdict that the resurrection account was true. It's just a very well attested fact. Now, many have sought to discredit the resurrection, and some of them, in the effort, have found themselves coming to believe it. What sort of efforts are made to deny that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, there's a theory about the fact that perhaps he was put in an unknown tomb. Some have tried to argue over the years that people who were executed, and of course Jesus Christ was executed on the cross, were actually taken outside the city of Jerusalem and thrown on the rubbish heap and left there to rot. But in June 1968, the tomb of a crucified Jew was discovered in Jerusalem. Jewish chap Yohanan ben Hagalal. And it proved that the crucified people were buried in marked graves. We're told there are many eyewitness accounts leading up to this, and there are 4 compilations which teach us that Jesus was buried in a known tomb, the private tomb of a wealthy man, Joseph of Arimathea, purchased and commissioned in his name. And that when people went to that known tomb, 3 days after he was laid in it, it was empty. There's another theory that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is just a legend or a myth that's cooked up centuries after the event to make it sound good, make Christianity seem credible. The assumption here is that the gospel accounts, which are written with historical intention, were written a long time after the events themselves. But you know, you can go up to London, you can look in the British Museum, and you can find there documents dating back to 20 to 50 years after the events that took place, describing those things in detail. That is, these things, these actual things that we have, were in circulation within the lifetime of people who themselves had been eyewitnesses of the resurrection events. And don't you think that if it was all a made-up story, those would have been discredited and would have passed out of circulation altogether? Others want to suggest that perhaps these appearances of Jesus alive again after death are because people were hallucinating or engaging in some sort of wish fulfillment. But you know, when you look at all the occasions, times of day, locations, different people he's appearing to, well over 500 witnesses saw him in one place at one time. He was eating and drinking and touching people and being touched, and he still bore the marks. The historical records, the accredited historical records tell us, of his own crucifixion. And don't you think, if Jesus' body was still kicking around somewhere, don't you think the Jewish authorities who wanted to discredit the accounts of his resurrection would have produced the body and disproved Christianity at the very outset? They were longing to do that, but they didn't because they couldn't. Other people suggest that what happened was that the disciples stole the body of Jesus to feign his resurrection. That requires that the men who'd abandoned and denied Jesus would suddenly have a change of heart, overcome a crack troop of 16 Roman guards and the authority of Rome that they represented. Those 16 guards, their own lives were at risk if they lost their prisoner represented by the body of Christ. and moved a 2-ton rock up out of the channel in which it sat and heaved it away, stole the body, and managed to hide it away somewhere. Well, the key objection to that theory seems to be this. Subsequent to all that happening, those men, founding fathers of the church, one of the ancient world's most influential institutions, noted for their purity and integrity, they were then prepared to go to extreme lengths to maintain the lie, if lie it was. John was exiled in the most appalling conditions for the last years of his life in his weakness as an older man. Stephen was prepared to be stoned to death, battered to death with rocks. Matthew was stabbed by a mob for his faith. Luke was hanged to death for this faith. Peter, Philip, Simon, reportedly crucified for this faith. Heathens skinned Bartholomew alive because he believed that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and wouldn't deny his faith. Thomas apparently pulled apart by a horse. The Apostle James beheaded by Herod. Little James sawn in two, can you imagine that? Because of his consistency to this story that Jesus Christ had died and been raised from the dead. Matthias, beheaded in Jerusalem. Paul, in all likelihood, killed under Nero because they held this faith. Who wants to die for a lie? Finally, some people have tried to suggest that Jesus actually just swooned on the cross, fainted under the stress of the day. Somehow, they say, he was taken and put into a tomb, this body, and the cool of the tomb revived him. Now that meant that Jesus went through 6 trials, was flogged beyond recognition by a Roman whip, the flagellum, which was a lot of lengths of leather with bits of stone and sharp metal tied into them. His back was flayed. Rendered so weak he couldn't carry his own cross, somebody else had to be brought in to do it, and then giant nails were thrust through his forearms and through his feet. And he lost a lot of blood in the heat of a Palestinian day. And then qualified and experienced executioners, wanting to be sure that he'd actually died, pushed a spear into his heart and outflowed blood and water as if the serum had separated from the red blood cells in his blood. A very clear evidence of death. We're being asked to believe that he fooled 4 professional executioners who were in good practice because business was good for them at that time. And then 100 pounds of gummy spices and bandages were encased around his body, and we're supposed to believe he didn't suffocate. And we are supposed then to think that he was put into a cold tomb without food or water for 2 days. And then the incredible happened. The cool, damp air of the tomb suddenly healed him, and he split out of his grave clothes, and he moved a 2-ton stone away from the door, and he fought off 16 Roman soldiers, and then he appeared to the disciples as the Lord of life. How believable does that seem to you? As far as I'm concerned, given the historical accreditation for the sources that describe what happened, given the probabilities being stacked against the other theories that are proposed to us as to what happened with Jesus' body, my suggestion to you is this: Jesus claimed to be God, and after dying by his resurrection proved that he is. I think that's a lot more credible than the other solutions that are proffered. All that's left for us to do is to decide how we're going to respond to that possibility that Christ has conquered death, because he promises to do the same for those who follow him. What do you think about it? Contact me by email. You'd be very welcome to do so. Simon@grace-llandilo.org.uk. I'd love to hear from you.